Hello class, welcome to Introduction to Sociology. We're going to start today with Chapter 1 and just go over some of the broad outlines when it comes to this course. What is sociology? Where did the field of sociology originate? We'll look at some of the kind of the founders of the field of sociology as well. And then we'll go over a little review of theory, but don't worry, especially toward like the second half of the lecture, we'll be coming back to all of that theory in Chapter 4. So we'll just do an overview today so you all get a pretty good idea of what this class is all about. And from there, each week we'll go into depth, into more specific concepts that sociology introduces and deals with. And my name is Kathleen Adams. I'll be your instructor this semester. You can always reach me at kadams@columbustech.edu. You're welcome to schedule an appointment to come into campus to meet with me. I'll be on campus every Wednesday and Thursday. And will be available for office hours on Wednesdays and Thursdays. So we'll get started here with Chapter 1, Introduction. Now, what is sociology? Sociology is the study of groups and group interactions, societies and social interactions, and that ranges from small and personal groups, like a classroom, to very large groups, like a nation. So a people who live in a defined geographic area, so they have particular borders that they live and work within and interact within, and they interact with one another and share a common culture is what sociologists call a society. Sociologists study social events, interactions, patterns, and they develop a theory in an attempt to explain why things work as they do. And this term sociology first came about and was coined in 1780 by the French essayist and political philosopher Emile Joseph Sieyès, and he had ties to the French Revolution. Now, one of my main goals for you during this semester is to help you all develop and become aware of the sociological imagination. And this term, the sociological imagination, came about in the 1950s, and a very renowned sociologist named C. Wright Mills wrote a piece entitled The Sociological Imagination, which we're going to read a few excerpts of on the next few slides. But basically, C. Wright Mills stressed the imperative that sociologists use the sociological imagination. What does that mean? It means developing an awareness of the relationship between somebody's behavior and experience and connecting it with the wider culture and society that shaped the person's choices and perceptions. So it's important to see people's behavior in relationship to history and social structure, things like institutions. Cultural patterns and social forces pressure people to choose one way of living over another, even though sometimes those people might not be aware that they are being pressured or forced to act or think in a certain way. So the basic kind of gist of what C. Wright Mills wants to get across in his book, Sociological Imagination, is that the individual and society are inseparable, and it's impossible to study one without taking the other into consideration. On this slide, I have a little short introductory video on C. Wright Mills and the sociological imagination, if you want to watch that and just get a little bit of a more thorough understanding of C. Wright Mills' book. So you can find the full PDF of Chapter 1 from C. Wright Mills' book on Blackboard under the Chapter 1 content link. But in this PowerPoint, I've included some of the most kind of important excerpts of the chapter. So we'll read over these excerpts and then we'll get started once you have a little bit of an idea of what the sociological imagination means. We will head into the meat and bones of Chapter 1. So we'll start here. Nowadays, people often feel that their private lives are a series of traps. They sense that within their everyday worlds, they cannot overcome their troubles. And in this feeling, they are often quite correct. What ordinary people are directly aware of and what they try to do are bounded by the private orbits in which they live. Their visions and their powers are limited to the close-up scenes of job, family, neighborhood. In other milieu, and milieu just means different perspectives or different social situations. So in other milieu, they move vicariously and remain spectators. And the more aware they become, however vaguely, of ambitions and of threats which transcend their immediate locales, the more trapped they seem to feel. Underlying this sense of being trapped are seemingly impersonal changes in the very structure of continent-wide societies. The facts of contemporary history are also facts about the success and the failure of individual men and women. When a society is industrialized, a peasant becomes a worker. A feudal lord is liquidated or becomes a businessman. When classes rise or fall, a person is employed or unemployed. When the rate of investment goes up or down, a person takes new heart or goes broke. When wars happen, an insurance salesperson becomes a rocket launcher, a store clerk a radar operator. A wife or a husband lives alone. A child grows up without a parent. Neither the life of an individual nor the history of a society can be understood without understanding both. Yet, people do not usually define the troubles they endure in terms of historical change and institutional contradiction. The well-being they enjoy, they do not usually impute to the big ups and downs of the societies in which they live. Seldom aware of the intricate connection between the patterns of their own lives and the course of world history, ordinary people do not usually know what this connection means for the kinds of people they are becoming and for the kinds of history making in which they might take part. They do not possess the quality of mind essential to grasp the interplay of individuals and society, of biography and history, of self and world. They cannot cope with their personal troubles in such ways as to control the structural transformations that usually lie behind them. Surely it is no wonder. In what period have so many people been so totally exposed at so fast a pace to such earthquakes of change? That Americans have not known such catastrophic changes as have the men and women of other societies is due to historical facts that are now quickly becoming merely history. The history that now affects every individual is world history. Within this scene and this period, in the course of a single generation, 1/6 of humankind is transformed from all that is feudal and backward into all that is modern, advanced, and fearful. Political colonies are freed, new and less visible forms of imperialism installed. Revolutions occur, people feel the intimate grip of new kinds of authority. Totalitarian societies rise and are smashed to bits or succeed fabulously. After 2 centuries of ascendancy, capitalism is shown up as only one way to make society into an industrial apparatus. After 2 centuries of hope, even formal democracy is restricted to a quite small portion of mankind. Everywhere in the underdeveloped world, ancient ways of life are broken up and vague expectations become urgent demands. Everywhere in the overdeveloped world, the means of authority and of violence become total in scope and bureaucratic in form. Humanity itself now lies before us, the supernation at either pole, concentrating its most coordinated and massive efforts upon the preparation of World War III. So here, just remember, C. Wright Mills is writing in the 1950s, so he's kind of writing about those 2 poles of the USSR and the US, and kind of communicating that fear that the Cold War would turn into World War III. So just kind of keep that historical context of when he's writing in mind here. The very shaping of history now outpaces the ability of people to orient themselves in accordance with cherished values. And which values? Even when they do not panic, people often sense that older ways of feeling and thinking have collapsed, and that newer beginnings are ambiguous to the point of moral stasis. Is it any wonder that ordinary people feel they cannot cope with the larger worlds with which they are so suddenly confronted? That they cannot understand the meaning of their epoch for their own lives? That, in defense of selfhood, they become morally insensible, trying to remain altogether private individuals? Is it any wonder that they come to be possessed by a sense of the trap? It is not only information that they need. In this age of fact, information often dominates their attention and overwhelms their capacities to assimilate it. It is not only the skills of reason that they need, although their struggles to acquire these often exhaust their limited moral energy. What they need and what they feel they need is a quality of mind that will help them to use information and to develop reason in order to achieve lucid summations of what is going on in the world and of what may be happening within themselves. It is this quality, I am going to contend, that journalists and scholars, artists and publics, scientists and editors are coming to expect of what may be called the sociological imagination. The sociological imagination enables its possessor to understand the larger historical scene in terms of its meaning for the inner life and the external career of a variety of individuals. It enables him to take into account how individuals, in the welter of their daily experience, often become falsely conscious of their social positions. Within that welter, the framework of modern society is sought, and within that framework, the psychologies of a variety of men and women are formulated. By such means, the personal uneasiness of individuals is focused upon explicit troubles, and the indifference of publics is transformed into involvement with public issues. The first fruit of this imagination, and the first lesson of the social science that embodies it, is the idea that the individual can understand her own experience and gauge her own fate only by locating herself within her period, that she can know her own chances in life only by becoming aware of those of all individuals in her circumstances. In many ways, it is a terrible lesson, in many ways a magnificent one. We do not know the limits of humans' capacity for supreme effort or willing degradation, for agony or glee, for pleasurable brutality or the sweetness of reason. But in our time, we have come to know that the limits of human nature are frighteningly broad. We have come to know that every individual lives, from one generation to the next, in some society, that he lives out a biography and lives it out within some historical sequence. By the fact of this living, he contributes, however minutely, to the shaping of this society and to the course of its history, even as he is made by society and by its historical push and shove. The sociological imagination enables us to grasp history and biography and the relations between the two within society. That is its task and its promise. To recognize this task and this promise is the mark of the classic social analyst. And then he talks about some different sociologists. So we're going to skip kind of the rest of that paragraph here. And then we'll start here. No social study that does not come back to the problems of biography, of history, and of their intersections within a society has completed its intellectual journey. Whatever the specific problems of the classic social analysts, however limited or however broad the features of social reality they have examined, those who have been imaginatively aware of the promise of their work have consistently asked three sorts of questions. So here's his three sets of questions. I've got the first set up top. And that says, what is the structure of this particular society as a whole? What are its essential components, and how are they related to one another? How does it differ from other varieties of social order? Within it, what is the meaning of any particular feature for its continuance and for its change? And the second set of questions, where does the society stand in human history? What are the mechanics by which it's changing? What is its place within and its meaning for the development of humanity as a whole? How does any particular feature we're examining affect, and how is it affected by, the historical period in which it moves? And this period, what are its essential features? How does it differ from other periods? What are its characteristic ways of history making? And then the last set of questions, the third, is what varieties of men and women now prevail in this society and in this period? What varieties are coming to prevail? In what ways are they selected and formed, liberated and repressed, made sensitive and blunted? What kinds of, quote, human nature are revealed in the conduct and character we observe in this society in this period? And what is the meaning for human nature of each and every feature of the society we are examining? Whether the point of interest is a great power state or a minor literary mood, a family, a prison, a creed, these are the kind of questions the best social analysts have asked. They are the intellectual pivots of classic studies of individuals in society. And they are the questions inevitably raised by any mind possessing the sociological imagination. For that imagination is the capacity to shift from one perspective to another, from the political to the psychological, from examination of a single family to comparative assessment of the national budgets of the world, from the theological school to the military establishment, from considerations of an oil industry to studies of contemporary poetry. It's the capacity to range from the most impersonal and remote transformations to the most intimate features of the human self, and importantly, to see the relations between the two. Back of its use, there is always the urge to know the social and historical meaning of the individual in the society and in the period in which she has her quality and her being. That, in brief, is why it is by means of the sociological imagination that men and women now hope to grasp what is going on in the world, and to understand what is happening in themselves as minute points of the intersections of biography and history within society. In large part, contemporary humanity's self-conscious view of itself as at least an outsider is not as a permanent stranger, rests upon an absorbed realization of social relativity and of the transformative power of history. The sociological imagination is the most fruitful form of this self-consciousness. By its use, people whose mentalities have swept only a series of limited orbits often come to feel as if suddenly awakened in a house with which they had only supposed themselves to be familiar. Correctly or incorrectly, they often come to feel that they can now provide themselves with adequate summations, cohesive assessments, comprehensive orientations. Older decisions that once appeared sound now seem to them products of a mind unaccountably dense. Their capacity for astonishment is made lively again. They acquire a new way of thinking. They experience a transvaluation of values. In a word, by their reflection and by their sensibility, they realize the cultural meaning of the social sciences. Perhaps the most fruitful distinction with which the sociological imagination works is between the personal troubles of milieu and the public issues of social structure. This distinction is an essential tool of the sociological imagination and a feature of all classic work in social science. So we'll go over these two kind of distinctions that he makes between troubles and issues here, and how kind of conceptualizing it this way, I think, makes it easier to understand what he's talking about when he says sociologists have to look at kind of these connections between personal biographies and social histories. So we'll start with troubles. Troubles occur within the character of the individual and within the range of his or her immediate relations with others. They have to do with oneself and those limited areas of social life in which one is directly and personally aware. Accordingly, this statement and the resolution of troubles properly lie within the individual as a biographical entity and within the scope of one's immediate milieu, the social setting that is directly open to her personal experience and to some extent her wishful activity. A trouble is a private matter. Values cherished by an individual are felt by her to be threatened. Now, what are issues? Issues have to do with matters that transcend these local environments of the individual and the range of her inner life. They have to do with the organization of many such milieu into the institutions of a historical society as a whole, with the ways in which various milieu overlap and interpenetrate to form the larger structure of social and historical life. An issue is a public matter. some value cherished by publics is felt to be threatened. Often there is a debate about what that value really is and about what it is that really threatens it. This debate is often without focus, if only because it is the very nature of an issue, unlike even widespread trouble, that it cannot very well be defined in terms of the immediate and everyday environments of ordinary people. An issue, in fact, often involves a crisis in institutional arrangements. And often, too, it involves what Marxists call contradictions or antagonisms. And now on the next couple slides, he gives you some examples to kind of illustrate what he means by this difference between biography and history, or troubles and issues. So first we'll look at unemployment. So in these terms, consider unemployment. When a city of 100,000, only one person is unemployed, that's that person's personal trouble. And for its relief, we properly look to the character of the individual, his skills, and his immediate opportunities. But when in a nation of 50 million employees, 15 million are unemployed, that then becomes an issue. And we may not hope to find its solution within the range of opportunities open to any one individual. The very structure of opportunities has collapsed. Both the correct statement of the problem and the range of possible solutions require us to consider the economic and political institutions of the society, and not merely the personal situation and character of a scatter of individuals. And his second example he gives here has to do with war. So consider war. The personal problem of war, when it occurs, may be how to survive it or how to die in it with honor, how to make money out of it, how to climb into the higher safety of the military apparatus, or how to contribute to the war's termination. In short, according to one's values, to find a set of milieu and within it to survive the war or make one's death in it meaningful. But the structural issues of war have to do with its causes, with what types of people it throws up into command, with its effects upon economic and political, family and religious institutions, with the unorganized irresponsibility of a world of nation states. And his third example is marriage. Consider marriage. Inside a marriage, a man and a woman may experience personal troubles. But when the divorce rate during the first 4 years of marriage is 250 out of every 1,000, this is an indication of a structural issue having to do with the institutions of marriage and the family and other institutions that bear upon them. And then the last one, he talks about the city. So consider the metropolis, the horrible, beautiful, ugly, magnificent sprawl of the great city. For many members of the upper class, the personal solution to the problem of the city is to have an apartment with a private garage under it in the heart of the city, and 40 miles out, a house by Henry Hill, garden by Garrett Ekbo, on 100 acres of private land. In these two controlled environments, with a small staff at each end and a private helicopter connection, most people could solve many of the problems of personal milieu caused by the facts of the city. But all this, however splendid, does not solve the public issues that the structural fact of the city poses. What should be done with this wonderful monstrosity? Break it all up into scattered units, combining residence and work, refurbish it as it stands, or after evacuation, dynamite it and build new cities according to new plans in new places. What should those plans be, and who is to decide and to accomplish whatever choice is made? These are structural issues. To confront them and to solve them requires us to consider political and economic issues that affect innumerable milieu. Insofar as an economy is so arranged that slumps occur, the problem of unemployment becomes incapable of a personal solution. Insofar as war is inherent in the nation-state system and in the uneven industrialization of the world, the ordinary individual in restricted milieu will be powerless, with or without psychiatric aid, to solve the troubles this system or lack of system imposes upon him. Insofar as the family as an institution turns women into darling little slaves and men into their chief providers and unweaned dependents, again, this was written in 1950s, the problem of a satisfactory marriage remains incapable of purely private solution. Insofar as the overdeveloped megalopolis, a city, and the overdeveloped automobile are built-in features of the overdeveloped society, the issues of urban living will not be solved by personal ingenuity and private wealth. What we experience in various and specific milieu, I have noted, is often caused by structural changes. Accordingly, to understand the changes of many personal milieu, we are required to look beyond them. And the number and variety of such structural changes increase as the institutions within which we live become more embracing and more intricately connected with one another. To be aware of the idea of social structure and to use it with sensibility is to be capable of tracing such linkages among a great variety of milieu. To be able to do that is to possess the sociological imagination. So now that we've read those excerpts, just think about these questions for a few minutes. What, in your own words, does Mills mean by the sociological imagination? What is its promise? And why is it important to draw connections between history and biography, between the society at large and the individual's story within that society? And what's the difference between troubles, remember personal troubles, and social issues? Think of one of those examples he offered, like unemployment, where he said, if one person is unemployed in a society of 10,000 people, that's really not a social issue. That probably says more about that one person that's unemployed and their work ethic and their personal activities or beliefs than it says about the society at large. But again, if you're in a society of 1,250,000 people are unemployed, that becomes then a social issue and not a personal trouble anymore, because so many people are experiencing the same thing, are experiencing unemployment or underemployment. This says something more about the society and the way that certain institutions are working or not working for the people in the society. And it also means that there may not be a personal solution to getting out of unemployment. If it is a structural social issue, it may require structural or social solutions. And let's finish this little question. And how does discerning the differences and continuities between troubles and issues contribute to the development of the sociological imagination? And hopefully you've already read the Nasarima piece before we got started on this lecture, and my hope is that you are already kind of seeing connections between that rituals of the Nasarima reading and the sociological imagination. So now we'll get started with chapter 1. And I want you all to start by just thinking about the historical context for the emergence of sociology. There's a little video clip down here, and you can also find it on Blackboard, which will just kind of prime your mind to start thinking about this time period when sociology came about as a field of social science. So the founders of sociology were all inspired by the monumental social change that was brought about by the Industrial Revolution. So think about all the things that were happening at that time. Society was, of course, rapidly industrializing. There was a lot more pollution due to a lot of the coal that was being used. There was very bad sanitation. As people moved into the cities, there wasn't a lot of infrastructure in the cities for, plumbing and sanitation, and so a lot of disease was spreading. A lot of children were dying at young ages. A lot of workers were dying young because of the chemicals that they were working with in factories. Speaking of factories, society went through a huge change at this time from, kind of those feudal relations with the lords and the serfs and this common land that everyone lived on and worked. And with the Industrial Revolution, all of these kind of agrarian societies were transformed into urban societies, and all these people who lived on the land started moving away, moving into cities. And so there was a lot of changes, especially if you think about living back in a feudal era. You'd have a lot more space, perhaps a lot more privacy, large extended families living together. But with the Industrial Revolution, people moving into cities, a lot of people just moving with their nuclear family and separating from their extended families. A lot of people moving into really small, cramped apartments, whereas they might have had a large house out on a homestead before. So a lot of changes happening in society, both at kind of large institutional levels, but also on these kind of personal biographical levels as well. And a lot of changes happening within the family and within religion, within the workplace, obviously, moving into like this factory work mode rather than the agrarian farming the land kind of mode of work. You also kind of have this explosion of capitalist monetary relations coming out at this time. Workers going to the factories and selling their labor in exchange for a set wage. So a lot of changes happening during the Industrial Revolution. So you can watch that video for kind of a little quick history recap of the time period. Keep in mind how drastic these changes that were brought about during this transition must have been for the people who were going about their everyday lives, kind of living through this large social change that was kind of transforming their lives. So we're going to start by just giving a little overview of our founders of sociology here and what they did to help create this discipline of sociology. So we'll look at Auguste Comte, who was pretty much regarded as the founder of sociology. Then we'll look at Harriet Martineau, Karl Marx, Emile Durkheim, George Herbert Mead, and Max Weber. So Auguste Comte is considered kind of the main founder of sociology. He was kind of the person, the scholar that came out and said, we need to establish sociology as a respected social science, and kind of his life's mission was to make that happen. So some of the goals that our kind of founding fathers of sociology had here was one, to establish sociology as a social science and become kind of a respectable field, a field of study that would be respected by the other sciences. And then the second goal of sociology around this time was to kind of differentiate sociology from psychology, because a lot of times sociology and psychology will look at the same kind of issue, but they'll come out with different conclusions because of the focus of the particular field. Psychology, by definition, is really focused on the workings and the understandings within an individual's mind, but sociology came about mostly because a lot of scholars at the time were realizing that perhaps when it came to a lot of social issues, you needed to take a step beyond just the individual mind and look at kind of larger structural, institutional, social issues and interpret them differently. So Auguste Comte, he was living between 1798 and 1857. He wrote his famous book here, Introduction to Positive Philosophy. So he is a positivist, and we'll talk quite a bit more about what that means on the next few slides. But here's a quote from Comte. He said, "Positivism is a theory of knowledge according to which the only kind of sound knowledge available to humankind is that of science grounded in observation." So Comte and social science. Comte redefined sociology by introducing positivism. Positivism is a striving for scientific objectivity and predictability. So Comte wanted social scientists and sociologists to use the same scientific methods used in the natural sciences when studying society. By using the scientific method, social scientists could test and prove or disprove hypotheses so that they could identify laws that govern society. The emphasis here is on quantitative sociology. So quantitative having to do with things that can be measured or put into numerical form. So quantitative sociology uses analysis of data and statistical models derived from surveys. Think of like the US Census is one of the largest social surveys that takes place. And those surveys used large numbers of participants. So by identifying laws of society, social scientists could further identify ways to manipulate the social formulas so that they could help solve social problems like poverty or corruption. Then we have Harriet Martineau, and she was living between 1802 and 1876. And her famous book is here titled Society in America. And a little quote from her, she said, "If a test of civilization be sought, none can be so sure as the condition of that half of society over which the other half has power." So Harriet Martineau, she's the first person to translate Auguste Comte's writing from French to English. She was the first woman sociologist, and she was well known for performing the first systematic international comparison of social institutions. So she looked at, particularly she studied kind of different gender roles in different societies. So that's that first systematic international comparison. She looked at the way that marriages worked in different societies and compared them, looked at child rearing, education, and really focused on domestic life. So she believed sociologists should not just observe, but come up with solutions that benefit societies. And she argued that a sociologist must always keep religious, political, and economic institutions in mind, maintain a focus on both men and women's lives, and pay attention to social practices like marriage, child rearing, domestic, public, and religious life. So now we're going to look at Karl Marx, and not so much his political ideology of socialism and communism, but more so we'll focus on just kind of the view of society that he had. So here's a quote from Marx, and it says, "The history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles. Freeman and slave, patrician and plebeian, lord and serf, guildmaster and journeyman, in a word, oppressor and oppressed, stood in constant opposition to one another, carried on in an uninterrupted, now hidden, now open fight, that each time ended either in the revolutionary reconstitution of society at large, or in the common ruin of the contending classes. It is not the consciousness of men that determines their being, but on the contrary, their social being that determines their consciousness." So we'll talk a little bit about Marx here. If everything is not completely clear to you during this little overview, don't worry, we will return to all of this in a bit more detail in chapter 4. So Karl Marx is associated with sociology because, and as you'll see at the end of this lecture, his kind of thought process and his writings undergird this particular sociological perspective that we call conflict theory. And conflict theory basically assumes that in every society, there's always a certain group that is, quote, oppressing another group. That there's always kind of these power differentials between certain groups of people in every society. And those differentials also kind of create this hierarchy of different groups. So putting one group above another. So Karl Marx in 1848 co-published the Communist Manifesto, inspired by a lot of that social unrest that was created by the Industrial Revolution and the rise of capitalism. Notably, Marx rejected Comte's positivism. Remember, the positivism was all about objectivity and only studying things that you could measure and usually by way of some sort of social survey. But Marx was not so interested in mirroring sociology to the other sciences, like biology or geology or even psychology. So he believed that the history of social progress is defined by class struggle, the struggle of different social classes. In his case, he talked a lot about the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, and the bourgeoisie is the ruling class. If you ever heard the word bougie or bourgeois, usually associated with kind of a more luxurious way of living. So the bourgeoisie is the ruling class, and then the proletariat was the working class. And his main kind of conception was that these different social classes were in this constant struggle over what he calls the means of production. We'll come back to what that means on the next slide. And again, he was a large contributor to a term that you will be very well accustomed to by the end of this semester, which is conflict theory. And that basically means that social conflict between different groups leads to change in society. So what are those means of production that the different social classes fight over? It's anything that you need to produce anything. So means of production are tools, a hammer. Means of production are your factories, the infrastructure like railroads and internet, natural resources, whoever controls, the oil, or some of like the precious metals that go into making your cell phone, and raw materials. So whoever controls these things, the means of production, are the people who kind of wield the most power in society. And for Marx, during kind of this modern era, post-industrial revolution, those two major groups that were in conflict or in class struggle were again that bourgeoisie and the proletariat. The bourgeoisie represented private property and the people who owned most of the land, most of the property, and the means of production, while the proletariat represents your wage laborers, the people who find a job and agree with their boss, yes, I will work 12 hours a day for $1 an hour, and they kind of exchange their labor power for that wage, and it's an agreement, but as Marx interprets it, it's an agreement which oppresses the working class. And he has a little quote here. It says, "Labor does not appear as an end in itself, but as the servant of the wage." So he was kind of critical of modern society making labor into something that was commodified. So if you think in like the feudal era, no one was working out in the farm expecting an hourly wage in return. It was kind of a communal form of production. The serfs would maybe bring a certain amount of crops or a lamb or a chicken to the Lord once a week. And in exchange, the Lord let the serfs live on his land rent-free, as long as they brought him a little something every now and then. And in exchange, the Lord would protect them if any marauders ever came to attack their village. And Marx believed that kind of this new modern way of living and this new kind of division between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat led to what he called alienation, and that was due to this kind of new division of labor that was occurring within the factory. So when people went into factory jobs, especially in the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, again, everything was very almost dehumanizing, and everything was very kind of like broken up, like in the Fordist system, where everyone kind of just did one little thing. No individual worker was making like a full product with craftsmanship. Instead, each worker was assigned one small menial task that didn't take any training or education or knowledge. You no longer had to be an apprentice in order to join some sort of guild and gain a craft. Instead, you could just go into a factory, exchange, make an agreement with the employer, and go into work every day and do something very kind of monotonous, very boring, and repetitive. So Marx thought that kind of that division of labor within the factory was leading to alienation. And what he meant by that was this kind of estrangement from production and people. And this change that occurred where people started to view their work and other people as means to an end and not ends in themselves. And his quote down here says, each man or woman has a particular exclusive sphere of activity, which is forced upon him and which he cannot escape. In communist society, nobody has one exclusive sphere of activity, but each can become accomplished in any branch he wishes. So another important thing we're going to do a little overview of, and again, come back to this in chapter 4, for Marx is differentiating between what he calls the base and the superstructure. So for Marx, everything comes down to the base. And for Marx, that's the economic system. So again, if you've ever heard of Marx or are familiar, he's quite virulently against the capitalist system. And so he felt that every other facet of society is derived from your economic system. So the base, if you look over at the picture here, represents your relations of production, and that's your different groups in conflict. So the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, those are the relations. And then the means of production, again, all those things you need to produce, like tools, machines, infrastructure, land, raw materials. So all society is based on that, and everything else is kind of derivative of that base, or kind of serves the interests of the economic base. So institutions like education, family, religion, media, politics, philosophy, all of these institutions that we tend to think of as kind of autonomous, Marx said that these institutions actually embody the ruling ideas of the ruling class. In other words, they serve the interests of the capitalist system in order to kind of keep the working class in line and keep them from kind of questioning the relations of production. Now we're going to do a little overview on Emile Durkheim. Durkheim is another one we'll definitely be coming back to in chapter 4, so we'll just give it a little overview so you get a general idea, but not to worry if you don't completely grasp it yet. Again, we'll come back to Marx, Durkheim, and Max Weber, who we'll go over in a few slides. But those three gentlemen, Marx, Weber, and Durkheim, we'll definitely be returning to them in chapter 4 and throughout the class. So Durkheim was a kind of a disciple of Auguste Comte. So remember, Comte was that positivist, and he was really trying to strive for objectivity and things that you could measure and put into numerical form and analyze. So Durkheim wrote a lot of books, but this is one of his famous ones, and he talks about moral education. And there's a couple quotes from him here. "We do not condemn it because it's a crime, but it's a crime because we condemn it." So that one's kind of touching on the relativity of how we define deviance and crime, and how different societies view different actions differently. And then the second quote, "Things perceived as real become real in their consequences." So Emile Durkheim really, as a kind of this disciple of Auguste Comte, he studied under Auguste Comte, and though, remember, Auguste Comte was the first one to really say we need to make a formal science, social science of sociology, we need to make it a respectable field, Durkheim was really the one who put those plans into action. So Comte kind of paved the way, and Durkheim, as his student, kind of brought Comte's vision to reality. So Emile Durkheim, he helped to make sociology a formal discipline. He opened the first European department of sociology in 1895. And like Comte, he was aiming to create a science of social facts. So what are social facts? He felt that social facts were the ideas and worldview of individuals derived from the social order. And he called that worldview the collective conscious. So he said in every society, there are certain things that everyone in the society generally agrees to or has a consensus on. They agree that certain things are important, or they agree that certain things are wrong. And he referred to kind of that worldview that people just happen to share within a society as the collective conscious. And then social facts were kind of these things that made up the collective conscious. So different laws and morals, values, religious beliefs, customs, fashion, rituals, all of those things that kind of govern our social life. And so what he's really interested in studying was kind of trying to determine what the collective conscious was for each specific society. And he viewed conflict and chaos in society as a failure for social institutions to indoctrinate citizens with the collective norms and values. So he felt if there were any kind of social issues happening, it really came down to the failure of leadership in institutions like education or religion, or the economy to properly indoctrinate or communicate the collective conscience of society into individuals. So some key terms and ideas for Durkheim here. We're going to talk about norms and laws, institutions, symbols and rituals, and division of labor. And these four kind of key terms here represent what Durkheim felt was the most important thing to keeping society functioning and to kind of strengthening that collective conscious that brings us all together and serves to connect us all within a society. So first, norms and laws. So he felt the fundamental social facts, those rules to guide behavior and thinking, create social solidarity. Social solidarity basically means it's a view that we're all in this together. We are one society. What happens to me happens to you. It's a sense of camaraderie. And he felt that people in a society needed to kind of share that collective conscience in order to create social solidarity, in order to make a strong society. And he talked about kind of different ways of different forms of the law. So he looked at smaller primitive societies like pre-modern and said that in those smaller societies, or you can think of like Native American tribes, law within those societies was all about seeking retribution on behalf of the whole society. And in these pre-modern societies, Durkheim said that penal law kind of ruled the day. And that meant that there was a harsh punishment of the offender, but also that punishment could change day to day based on the whims of whoever the leader was, if he was in a bad mood or a good mood, and depending on who maybe broke the law, was it his brother or was it one of his enemies? And so everything was kind of very relative. And Durkheim compares that with our more large modern societies. And he said that with larger societies, we required more normative laws. So things that people would already know. If you steal from a store, you're going to go to jail for 2 years. So law became more normative. It became more clear. Laws started to be written down so that everyone in society knew kind of the difference between what was right and what was wrong, and everyone would be kind of held to those same standards. But he did say that enforcement is more fragmented and individualized. So here laws seek to restore justice and to compensate the individual party instead of the whole society, like we saw in previous pre-modern societies. And in modern society, we see the emergence of civil law, which seeks restitution on behalf of a victim to restore order to its original state. Now, the next key term for Durkheim deals with institutions. And Durkheim is also what we call an institutionalist. So for Durkheim, institutions are really the key to communicating and passing on that social collective conscious. So some key institutions that Durkheim pays attention to are education, religion, and the economy. So education, of course, school is central to the reform of society. It teaches children basic rules and provides the discipline of citizenship. Religion's the second institution here, but it's the most important one for Durkheim. He felt that religion was the, quote, social glue of society, the core source of social values. And that's because it kind of separates the sacred from the profane. It separates the spiritual from the everyday, in other words. And so if you have something that kind of in your life that you believe in, that is sacred, that is above the everyday, you can really instill these values of what's right and what's wrong in people more effectively than if they felt those values were coming from just a teacher at school. Instead, these values are coming from a common religion, a common God, and a common kind of moral order. So the sacred represents kind of this collective representation set apart from everyday society. It represents like the holy objects, like the your cross in your church, or the cross that you wear around your neck, and holy practices identified by religious institutions. Also represents different holidays and symbols associated with religion, and how those symbols and holidays kind of serve to strengthen that collective conscious. And then again, the profane represents that mundane, everyday life, your housework and your work activities. So again, for Durkheim, religion is the social glue of society. And if you really think about it, if that's what Durkheim thinks, then if we pull that apart, Durkheim would think that a society that does not have a common religion will not be successful in his view. And then the third institution is the economy. And we'll touch on that, I believe, in a couple slides, but the economy was important for Durkheim because he felt, unlike Marx, who felt the division of labor kind of alienated people, Durkheim felt that the division of labor actually tied people together, tied society together, and made everyone depend on one another. And for Durkheim, he felt that the division of labor definitely strengthened that collective conscious instead of, as Marx was viewing it, creating conflict. Now for Durkheim, another very important aspect to kind of strengthening that collective conscious are shared symbols and rituals in the society. So we'll look particularly at kind of American society here to understand what that means. So some cultural symbols in American society would be our flag with the 50 stars, the 13 stripes, kind of represent our founding and where we're going. Another symbol in American culture would be Mount Rushmore. It's kind of representation of our founding fathers, or the Constitution, which represents our rights in this society and, at least in theory, the equality of all people. Of course, we'll come back to that throughout this class. And then the bald eagle is another kind of cultural symbol of American values. And then we have some rituals down here. So we've got the singing of the Star-Spangled Banner as a ritual. Especially we do this before football games. Then we have the ritual of Christmas, which not just an American ritual, but it's a religious ritual that does kind of represent coming together as family and to kind of strive for moral betterment. Then we have voting day. It's an important ritual especially in American society, to remind us that we live in a democracy. We all have an equal vote, and whoever receives the most votes wins. And we have Memorial Day, another ritual to remind us of those who have fought for our country, to be humbled by that and thankful. And then the 4th of July. And back to what I was talking to back on the institution slide about how the economy plays a part for Durkheim. And I mentioned that division of labor and how that kind of contrasted with Marx. So for Durkheim, the division of labor creates interdependence rather than conflict, as Marx saw it. So division of labor creates interdependence and serves as a basis for sustaining the social order. Division of different tasks within society maintains the material survival of all citizens. And the division of labor fundamentally integrates society rather than Marx's conception of the division of labor creating class conflict. Another important aspect to Durkheim's work is his view of modernity and deviance. And he has a quote right here. It says, "Man cannot become attached to higher aims and submit to a rule if he sees nothing above him to which he belongs. To free him from all social pressure is to abandon him to himself and demoralize him." So Durkheim was, like all of these sociologists, really interested in what was happening to society with modernization. Again, that kind of growth and increasing complexity of society. And he felt that modernization was eating away at kind of these social norms that people had come to hold in common. And this was creating a lot of fragmentation and individuation. So, in other words, he felt with modernity and the Industrial Revolution and all these social changes happening, kind of the collective conscious was becoming more and more weak. People were not feeling a sense of social solidarity with each other. There was so much change and not a lot of stability. And so a lot of the social norms that had maybe ruled societies for hundreds of years prior to industrialization were kind of falling apart because those old norms did not really fit or align with this new social world that had opened up. So Durkheim felt that deviance, which represents kind of crime, suicide, homicide, theft, he felt that deviance increases with modernization. And that's because the collective conscious exerts less influence over individuals. And he wrote a book, which we will talk a bit more about in chapter 4. But he wrote a book called Suicide back in 1897. And his conclusion in the book was that suicide was not due to biology or psychology. And he found, he did an international comparison of suicide rates in different countries, and he found that the suicide rate differed drastically depending on what society you were looking at. And because of that is why he concluded, well, it can't just have to do with psychology or something wrong in someone's brain. There has to be a social explanation for it, because if it was just a psychological phenomenon, something that just happens in certain people's brains, then you would assume that you would probably have pretty similar suicide rates in every country that you looked at. But he found quite the opposite. So his conclusion was that the societies that had the highest suicide rates were guilty of kind of insufficiently communicating common norms to the people in their society, that there was an inadequate integration into society. And that, for Durkheim, of course, had to do with shared norms and powerful institutions that were communicating the collective conscious. Again, religion, a common religion, and kind of this very strong collective conscious. So basically, Durkheim felt with modernization there was a lot more individualism, a lot less kind of communal thinking, and people were doing different things, people were believing in different things, and this was kind of tearing apart that collective conscious, these common sets of morals and norms that society had kind of been accustomed to before all of this modern change took place. So there's a little overview video on Durkheim here. You can also find that on Blackboard if you just want a little refresher at any point on the basics of Durkheim. And then there's a clip here from a movie called The Lottery. We'll come back to this movie and how it applies to Durkheim in chapter 4. So you don't need to really worry about watching that yet. All right, now we'll take a few moments to look at George Herbert Mead and his famous book, Mind, Self, and Society. So Mead said that social psychology is especially interested in the effect which the social group has in the determination of the experience and conduct of the individual member. Another quote from Mead, "A multiple personality is in a certain sense normal." So George Herbert Mead, unlike Durkheim, unlike Marx, and unlike Weber, who we'll talk about on the next slide, Mead was not really interested in looking at these huge social changes at the nation level or at the economic level. He was more interested in what we call the micro level and qualitative analysis. So he studied more like small groups or just the individual and tried to understand how that individual was a mirror of the larger society that they lived in. So he, in particular, studied the concept of the self and how it's shaped by social processes. And he said how we define our self is relational and always in flux, always changing, depending on what audience we are imagining ourselves performing for. So he argued that the way a person comes to view himself or herself is based to a very large extent on interactions with others. like our significant others, our family, our spouse and neighbors, or generalized others, like the organized and generalized attitude of a social group. And again, we'll come back to Mead later in the class, during the semester. And the last sociologist we're going to do a little overview of today is Max Weber. And he wrote a famous book called Economy and Society. And a couple quotes from Weber. We have, "It is true that the path of human destiny cannot but appall him who surveys a section of it, but he will do well to keep his small personal commentary to himself, as one does at the sight of the sea or of majestic mountains, unless he knows himself to be called and gifted to give them expression in artistic or prophetic form. In most other cases, the voluminous talk about intuition does nothing but conceal a lack of perspective toward the object, which merits the same judgment as a similar lack of perspective toward men. And in the realm of science, what we have achieved will be obsolete in 10, 20, or 50 years. That is the fate, indeed, that is the very meaning of scientific work. Every scientific, quote, fulfillment raises new questions and cries out to be surpassed, rendered obsolete. Everyone who wishes to serve science has resigned himself to this." So hopefully from those quotes you kind of gleaned that Max Weber is an anti-positivist. He felt that complete objectivity is impossible when it comes to social research. That's contrary to Comte and Durkheim's positivism. Instead, social researchers should strive for subjectivity, Max Weber felt, as they worked to represent social processes, cultural norms, and societal values. For Weber, the aim is not to generalize or predict, as it was with Comte and Durkheim, but the aim of sociology is to systematically gain an in-depth understanding of social worlds. And he used this word Verstehen a lot, and Verstehen means the outside observers of a social world attempt to understand it from the insider's point of view. So Verstehen, hopefully when you think about that term, you're making connections back to that reading on the sociological imagination and the Nasarima reading. So Weber just felt it was very important for social scientists not to strive for objectivity, because no human can really be objective when it comes to looking at other societies. You're always going to look at a society with some of your own preconceived notions, kind of already affecting your view of other societies. So he said that we needed to utilize this concept of Verstehen, being able to look at another social world and try to understand it from their point of view. So for him, the emphasis again is qualitative sociology, as it was with Mead. So not quantitative, not numbers and statistics and surveys, but qualitative. So his research involved more kind of historical analysis and in-depth interviews, focus groups, and content analysis, like looking at different books or magazines or television movies that a certain society puts out. So for Weber, society means the structures of legitimate authority and domination. And he felt there were 3 different types of legitimate authority over time in human history. The first is traditional legitimate authority, and these were based on established patterns and norms, and most of these traditional forms reigned in the pre-industrial or pre-modern era and is represented by your kings or your chiefs and your feudal lords. The second type of legitimate authority for Weber is charismatic, and that is represented by a non-transferable power once the charismatic leader passes away. So some examples of charismatic leaders would be Gandhi or Castro in Cuba, or Martin Luther King Jr., or even Hitler. And then the third type, which he felt was the most long-lasting form of legitimate authority, is rational legal. And that's represented by what you might be familiar with, the term bureaucracy. So Weber felt that with industry and modernization comes this increasing complexity. And bureaucracy and bureaucratic organization kind of filled this social hole that was created by modernization. And he viewed bureaucracy as the most stable form of legitimacy. And why is it so stable? Because it's effective, it gets things done, it's impartial, at least in theory, it treats all people kind of equally, and it's rules-based. So everything is written down, formalized, and everyone in society knows exactly what is expected of them. In bureaucratic organizations, power is vested in the impersonal office instead of any particular person. So we, as American citizens, we respect the office of the presidency, regardless of who's in that office, or what you think about the person sitting in that office. You still respect the office itself. And in addition, with elections and bureaucratic forms of legitimacy, someone else will fill in that office eventually after 4 years or 8 years. And so the power is not particularly in the hands of that person, but the power stays with that impersonal office, regardless of who is sitting in that office or position. So one of Weber's most famous books is called The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. It was published in 1905. And if you just at any point need a little refresher, there's a video that kind of gives a good summary of the Protestant ethic here, and you can find it on Blackboard. But basically, Weber said that Protestantism was the moral foundation for capitalism's spread. So Weber is basically saying that the kind of religious revolution that happened with Martin Luther and John Calvin within Christianity kind of coincided and laid the groundwork for capitalism and industrialism to spread and become accepted or acceptable. And why is that? Because he said that Protestantism preached a certain type of asceticism. And what does asceticism mean? It means not making your life about enjoyment or idleness or laziness. A key kind of aspect of Protestantism is productivity and working for the glory of God, so to speak. Another kind of key factor of asceticism is this view that wasting time is a sin, that you should always be productive, always working, never being lazy, because what's the saying? Idle hands are the devil's playground, something like that. And asceticism also meant abstinence from self-indulgence. Also, with some of the changes that happened in Christianity at this time, salvation started to be understood as proven through worldly success and wealth. So if you were successful, if you were a great businessman, or you had a lot of money, made a lot of money in industry, that became that was interpreted as a sign that God had chosen you to be powerful and influential. Another change that happened with Protestantism at this time was that the believer had to demonstrate their religious allegiance in this life by participating in the world. And a lot of forms of Christianity prior to Protestantism were all about kind of retreating from the world, retreating from the sins of society, and kind of closing yourself off. But with Protestantism, it was about going out into the world, participating in the world, working hard, and you were supposed to kind of save others by doing that instead of closing yourself off. And then kind of the main thing for Weber that comes about during this time is this idea of a life task or the individual calling. And that represented this devotion to work. And he has a quote here: "The Puritan wanted to work in a calling. We are forced to do so." And again, we'll come back to the Protestant ethic in chapter 4. We'll even read an excerpt out of it as well there. Now, one thing that really sets Weber apart from Marx, for instance, is how Weber views divisions within society. So for Weber, power means the ability of one person or one group of people to impose their will. That will can be sought for economic gain, social honor, or for its own sake. So for Marx, remember, it's all about just the social classes of bourgeoisie and proletariat against each other in conflict. But Weber certainly recognizes social class, but also talks about status and party and political associations when it comes to power in society. So social class, again, it's that general aggregate of people who share a similar position in the labor market. However, unlike Marx, who felt there was kind of an inherent solidarity or community between the rich and the poor, the owners and the workers, Weber did not think that social class led to inherent solidarity. And he felt that social class kind of lacked a common basis for organization and action. That just because you and another person both make $10 a day for working 12 hours, that doesn't mean that you necessarily see each other as kind of part of the same group or society, or that you're going to look out for one another. Weber felt that status and political association were more powerful kind of drivers in society. So status represents common occupational or professional positions, like lawyers or doctors, actors, or different religious sects. Status groups have solidarity based on shared values and common lifestyles. And then party and political associations were also important in defining divisions within society, especially because they organize specifically to pursue and exercise state power. For Weber, when he was looking at kind of modern societies and industrialized societies, he felt the most important thing to look at was the modern state and bureaucratic administration. So he felt that the state and bureaucracy had as much influence as the economy when it came to different societies. He felt that state authority and domination was central to modernity. So if you go back historically, right around the same time that capitalism was really taking hold on a global scale, and industrialism, kind of these social changes coincided with and strengthened the kind of centralization of power in the nation states, and kind of the organization of nation states. So he felt that a lot of these modern nation states, they were being filled with full-time civil servants, and these are permanent employees of the state who carry out the law formulated by elected officials. If you listen to the news, especially recently, and you've heard people with conspiracy theories about the deep state and whatnot, these are the people that they're referring to, these full-time civil servants. They're not elected. They kind of stay in the machinations of the state and the law, and that's their full-time job throughout their life. And Weber also felt, again, back to kind of that rational legal legitimacy, that universal and impersonal rule, that bureaucracies in the modern state were kind of the most stable form of social organization. Remember, compared against those traditional or those charismatic forms of leadership and legitimacy. However, he felt that with bureaucracy and the modern state, people in society were becoming alienated, but not from the means of production, like Marx said, but from the means of administration. So kind of the means of being able to administer and kind of create your own life. He felt that bureaucracies kind of hindered the human spirit. And he was pessimistic about kind of our emancipation from bureaucracies. He felt there was no end point in sight because bureaucracies were so stable, because of those impersonal offices that people just fill in for 4 years or 6 years or 8 years and then are replaced. Again, power and bureaucracy is all about those impersonal offices, not about a particular person. And that way, if a particular person passes away, the entire structure of society and the state doesn't pass away with them. Someone else comes to fill that role or fill that office. So Weber felt that because there was kind of no endpoint in bureaucracies, and because people in bureaucracies are alienated from the means of administration, that kind of people in bureaucratic societies become prisoners of the iron cage of modern institutions. In a way, we're kind of trapped in this bureaucratic maze. And he felt the most dominant feature of modern Western bureaucracies was the rationalization of life. And this was kind of a consequence of bureaucracy in the state and rationalization and kind of that state level. But he felt that rationalization had kind of seeped its way into every aspect of our social life, and Weber was pretty pessimistic about this. So what is the rationalization of life? It is defined by calculability, predictability, technical efficiency, and an instrumental and scientific worldview. It's this idea that we can master all things by calculation. And bureaucracy and rationalization puts a lot of emphasis on precision, speed, record keeping, like paperwork, knowledge of the files. So, for instance, if you're a lawyer, you need to study the law and how the law came about and have that knowledge. And strict subordination, so kind of hierarchies of responsibility that we see kind of in every arena of our life. And Weber felt there were positives to bureaucracies and rationalization. Definitely technical superiority was rooted in kind of this hierarchical structure, these chains of commands, competent and trained officials who knew what they're doing, specialized divisions of labor to efficiently carry out tasks. But he also saw some cons or drawbacks to this way of living and thinking. And some of those were, first, that it's dehumanizing. He felt that bureaucracies did not really pay enough attention to justice, humanity, and equality. He felt that bureaucracies and rationalization alienates people, and he called that the disenchantment of life. And he felt that all this rationalization leads to a loss of meaning or a loss of spirituality. And he felt that as the state becomes more complex and centralized, the power of individuals is diminished. Certain values, traditions, and emotions eventually become displaced by formal and impersonal bureaucratic practices. And he has a famous quote here, specialists without spirit, sensualists without heart. This nullity imagines that it has attained a level of civilization never before achieved. So on this slide, I have a bunch of different short video clips. if you're kind of struggling with Weber's conception of society and his critique of bureaucracy and rationalization, go ahead and watch just a few of these clips here, and I think you'll see kind of his thoughts illustrated. So I have a few clips from a film called Brazil from the 80s that kind of illustrate this bureaucracy and rationalization and dehumanization. Or I have a clip here that talks about online dating and the different algorithms that go into kind of making love calculable, which is one aspect of rationalization: calculability, predictability. We have a little video on suburban order, kind of the uniformity of houses, especially in suburbia, factory farming. There's a clip here from an old I Love Lucy sketch, The Irrationality of Rationalization. If you've ever seen that clip of Lucille Ball in the chocolate factory, and she's working there and they keep speeding up the production line. It's all about speed and precision. But eventually Lucy can't keep up with the production line, and of course it's a comedic show, so it's a little bit of a funny clip, but definitely illustrates Weber's perspective here of how rationality can become kind of dehumanizing as well. And then some clips here of rationalization in the workplace. I have a few clips from Charlie Chaplin's Modern Times and from the movie Office Space. And there's a clip here about children and the education system. Now we've kind of finished up our broad overview of these founders of sociology. And now I'm going to give you a little bit of an introduction to the three main theoretical paradigms within sociology. Basically, a paradigm is a philosophical and theoretical framework that's used within a discipline in order to formulate theories, generalizations, and the experiments performed in support of them. What does that mean? Basically, a paradigm is a perspective, a way of looking at something, a way of interpreting what you're studying. You can think of these paradigms as like different colored glasses that you put on, and you might see the same social problem but come to a different conclusion based on kind of the paradigm that you're working within. So we will talk about these three major theoretical paradigms within sociology. Those are structural functionalism, conflict theory, and symbolic interactionism. So we'll start here with our first paradigm or perspective within sociology, and this one is known as structural functionalism. And this one comes about from the work of Auguste Comte and Harriet Martineau and Emile Durkheim, most notably. So what is structural functionalism? Just like the little picture on the right says, in the same way that the skin holds the human body, so too do norms and values bind society together. So structural functionalism kind of envisions societies as this metaphor for a human body. And all of the institutions and the norms and our education system and religion and economy, state structure, all of this, all of these institutions kind of are supposed to work together in the same way that the organs in our body work together in order to make and maintain a very healthy social body. So structural functionalism sees society as a structure with interrelated parts, like all those institutions, and all the interrelated parts are designed to meet the biological and social needs of the individuals in society. In a healthy society, one that is held together by that strong collective conscience that Durkheim wrote about, with those shared values and language and symbols, all of the parts in society work together to maintain stability. And that's a state that structural functionalists call dynamic equilibrium. However, in an unhealthy society, like Durkheim would say, if there's some sort of dysfunction, if there's high crime rates or high divorce rates or high suicide rates, Durkheim and a structural functionalist would try and figure out what institutions in society are not properly or effectively communicating those social norms and values, and a structural functionalist would then try to figure out what needs to be done to resolve that dysfunction and kind of bring everything back into that state of dynamic equilibrium or a healthy social body. Now, what all this kind of amounts to, though, is that structural functionalism is really skeptical of any rapid social change, any fast social change, and any other major social upheaval. So any sudden change in society to a structural functionalist means that stability and the future of the society is threatened. Now, when a social problem does occur, like high crime rates or high divorce rates, it might threaten a society's stability, but that doesn't mean that fundamental flaws in the society exist. So for a structural functionalist, instead of some sort of huge social change to address a social problem, instead they would propose some sort of gradual social reform to address that social problem. And moreover, functionalists even suggest that social problems are functional in their own way for society, because otherwise social problems would not continue. So, for example, like crime or poverty, structural functionalists view these social problems as somewhat functional and not really evidence of much of a problem. What does that mean? For instance, they would say crime is functional because if somebody commits a crime and is then punished for it, number one, it proves to all the other citizens in the society or members of the society that the laws are enforced and that there will be punishment for crimes. So that's kind of a functional perspective. And moreover, functionalists would say crime is functional because, say, it provides jobs for a lot of people in the society, like people who work in prisons or jails or corrections, social workers, judges, lawyers, etc. So structural functionalists would certainly see that crime, has deleterious effects on society, but crime might serve a function when it comes to that overall social body. And some critiques of structural functionalism. Number one, critics would say that structural functionalists can't adequately explain social change, which, if you think about everything we just talked about on the previous slide, kind of makes sense. They view any kind of drastic social change as dysfunctional and inadequate for society. And so any kind of huge social change, think about the Me Too movement or the Black Lives Matter movement, the Arab Spring, the French Revolution. Structural functionalists wouldn't really know how to address kind of these big social changes that are happening, because again, they're more interested or more supportive of kind of that gradual, small-scale reforms and no big changes. Another critique of structural functionalism is that it kind of has a circular reasoning. So they say that repetitive behavior patterns in society are assumed to have a function, and at the same time, they assume something has a function because it is repeated. So it's kind of like the chicken and the egg. How do we know that the way society is currently functioning is the best functioning society if we're always just trying to kind of bring things back to an equilibrium? And the third critique is that dysfunction might be prolonged or continuous. It might not just last a year or 5 years, it might last 15, 20 years or longer. So a dysfunction might last a very long time, even though it doesn't serve a, quote, function. And that kind of, in this perspective, contradicts that basic premise of the theory. So we'll come back, in every chapter, we'll come back to these 3 different paradigms that we're going to go over here, and we'll kind of draw them out throughout the semester. So if you're at this point a little bit still confused with the difference between the 3, just try and understand the broad outlines, and I promise throughout the semester we'll kind of go into a bit more detail and also see these perspectives and paradigms kind of applied to the future lessons, so you can kind of see them in action and applied to very specific, concrete social issues. But I'm going to give you, today we're going to look at these 3 paradigms, and I'm going to work with an example of armed robbery. And we'll just look at what each different perspective would think of armed robbery. So we just finished up structural functionalism. So what would a structural functionalist think about armed robbery? They might suggest that robbery actually serves positive functions for society, again, like job creating, just as I was talking about a minute ago. It would also think that efforts should be made to reduce armed robbery, but it would also assume that far-reaching changes in our society would not be wise or necessary to reduce crime. So now we'll move on to conflict theory. And again, conflict theory is really rooted in Karl Marx, again, who was kind of viewing those 2 big economic classes, the bourgeoisie versus the proletariat, the corporate owners, property owners versus the working people. Now, conflict theory has changed over time. It's grown a lot and expanded beyond just economic classes in conflict. And as we'll see throughout this class, conflict theory is now being applied to a lot of different kind of conflicts between social groups in society. So yes, it's still applied in terms of like the rich versus the poor, or the owners versus the workers, but nowadays we also see it applied to gender studies, queer studies, racial studies as well. So conflict theory is what we call a macro level theory, and that means it's making really broad assumptions about society. And it kind of views society as this competition for limited resources. So there's always groups in competition to kind of get more power, more status. And to, on the other side, to possibly like subjugate another group. So again, Karl Marx popularized conflict theory and said that society was made up of different economic classes competing for social, political, and material resources. Now, Max Weber, who we also talked about, is also a conflict theorist, but remember he talked a lot about like state power and the power of political parties. So Weber was a conflict theorist, but he kind of went beyond Marx and stated that conflicts weren't just about economic inequality, but also about political power and social structure. So conflict theory, again, emphasizes that different groups in society have different interests stemming from their different social positions. And conflict theory, unlike structural functionalism, assumes that fundamental social change is needed to address society's many social problems. So conflict theory is all about revolution and big social change coming about, whereas again, structural functionalism was very much against any kind of major change. It just wants kind of these small incremental reforms. So some critiques of conflict theory. It tends to focus on conflict at the exclusion of recognizing stability. So obviously, surely there's conflict in society, but yet societies continue to exist, and people within society continue to interact with one another. And you would think if a society is so overwhelmingly dysfunctional that there wouldn't be any room for this kind of stability and this day-to-day kind of normalcy. So critics, especially like structural functionalists, would say society is not just about all these groups and conflict with one another. There's other things that beyond that tie people together and again kind of like construct that social collective conscious. Another critique of conflict theory would be many social structures are extremely stable and have progressed over time rather than changing abruptly as conflict theory would suggest. So again, conflict theory is all about these different groups and competition and these constant kind of fights, again, conflict with one another in order to get more power, more status, more money. And because of that, it focuses a lot on like major fights and protests and rebellions and revolutions, and points to that as how society changes and moves with history. But a structural functionalist would critique it and say that not every society or every institution has undergone very quick, rapid monumental social change. Certainly there have been some, but not all have. So they point out that a lot of changes that happen within our institutions and in society happen really slowly, progressively over time. Small changes build up into a larger change over a long period of time, which is opposite of what conflict theory would suggest. Now we'll go back to that kind of our example for the day to kind of parse these out. So what would conflict theory think of armed robbery? They would take a very different approach from that structural functionalist. And conflict theorists would note that most street criminals are poor, and thus emphasize that armed robbery is the result of kind of the despair and frustration of living in poverty and facing a lack of jobs and other opportunities for economic and social success. And our last theoretical paradigm or perspective that we're going to talk about is symbolic interactionism. So symbolic interactionism is a micro-level theory. So remember I said conflict theory is macro level, so is structural functionalism. And that means they're really looking at society as a whole and looking at this big picture. But symbolic interactionism kind of comes at studying society and social groups from a different, in fact, an opposite kind of approach. So they use a micro-level theory, and that means they're focused on people, individuals on the ground. It focuses on relationships between individuals in society. And they're very likely to use qualitative research methods, which means they're not going to be looking at numbers and statistics and surveys and all that. They're going to be getting on the ground, talking to people, interviewing them, observing them, and trying to understand a particular social world kind of from that perspective. So again, it focuses on the interactions of individuals and how they interpret their interactions. So communication, the exchange of meaning through symbols, is how people make sense of their worlds. And so this perspective sees individuals as being active in shaping their social world through the power of personal interpretation. So studies within symbolic interactionism will involve a lot of observation, one-on-one interactions, and they look for kind of these patterns of similar interactions occurring between individuals. Symbolic interactionism would also say that people don't just learn the roles that society has set out for them. Instead, they kind of play an active part in constructing their own social roles through interaction. And so we kind of socially construct our own realities. So an important term here within symbolic interactionism is constructivism. And that means that reality is what individuals cognitively construct it to be. Basically, reality is in our minds. So we create it by way of our interactions with our family or our school or our peers. We kind of create our reality, and then once we've created it, we tend to interpret our social world based on how we understand society to function. So for a constructivist, there's no absolute definition for crime or for deviance. or for family. Deviance, or really any institution or social action, can only be defined from within a specific society. Different societies have different conceptions of what deviance or crime or any other social institution means or is. Now, some criticisms of symbolic interactionism. Usually with micro-level theories, this kind of criticism is pretty standard. So a conflict theorist or a structural functionalist would critique symbolic interactionism by saying it's too subjective, meaning you're only basing your research by talking to, individuals, a few people, maybe 20 people in your study, whereas if a structural functionalist is doing a study and analyzing the U.S. Census, for example, as a survey in order to draw conclusions, the structural functionalist would be looking at social patterns in a really broad survey like the U.S. Census that covers a lot of people in the country and the society, whereas a symbolic interactionist would only, maybe since they're doing such one-on-one research and work, they might not have time to go and interview a million people one-on-one. They might just study 10 or 20. And so the critique is it can be too subjective. You might not be able to make a broad conclusion based on just talking to 20 people. And they would say it's too narrow of a focus, which is related. Now, of course, the whole point of symbolic interactionism is to be more subjective and more narrow. So a proponent of symbolic interactionism would actually consider those critiques to be its strengths. So it's just all about your perspective, and it really depends what you're studying, which of these paradigms or perspectives will be the most fruitful. And sometimes pieces of research from each of these paradigms, if you put them together, you get kind of the most holistic kind of view of that social problem or the society. So it's not necessarily that one is wrong and one is right in terms of these three perspectives. They all kind of bring different strengths and weaknesses. And it's really all about your perspective on whatever we're looking at or studying. So before we end today's lecture, let's go back to that example of armed robbery and what a symbolic interactionist would think about it. So symbolic interactionism would focus on how armed robbers make decisions as to when, where, and why to rob someone. They would also think about the interactions with other criminals that reinforce their own criminal kind of worldview or tendencies. So they would try and figure out, how did this person come to this lifestyle where they feel they need to rob somebody? Did they know people growing up who took part in this kind of crime, or did they meet someone recently and fell into this kind of world of criminal behavior? So I would be really interested in more of those relationships and the interactions that lead a criminal to make the decisions that they do. So those are our three big perspectives or theoretical paradigms when it comes to sociology: structural functionalism, conflict theory, and symbolic interactionism. And that also brings us to the end of our first lecture for Chapter 1, Introduction to Sociology. I know we went over quite a bit in this lecture, but remember, it's just an introduction. Almost everything that we've talked about today we'll come back to throughout the rest of the class and go over all of this in a lot more detail in the weeks to come. So thank you for listening to my lecture. Let me know if you have any questions. I'm always available at kadams@columbustech.edu. I'm on campus for office hours. Check Blackboard for my office hours. And if you'd prefer not to come to campus, you can always send me an email and I can schedule either a phone call with you or a Blackboard Collaborate session. So please be in touch with me. Let me know if you have any questions about the class or this lecture. And I'm happy to have y'all in the class for this semester. Hope y'all have a great first week of classes.